afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In today's series, we are talking about informal sector. This is part of the series of lecture on sociology of work. We try to understand the concept of informal sector and we realize that it is a concept that emerged with reference to the formal sector or formalization of labor, that is emergence of rules, regulations, protections for workers led to a category of workers who were denied these privilege, and they were kind of referred to as informal. And always there was kind of this economic dualism between the agricultural and industry, between tradition and modernity, that led to understanding the informal sector in opposition to the formal. Or if we kind of try to look into it, the informal sector was then kind of considered as a problem. Why a problem? Because it was a problem of migration, it was a problem of industrialization that led to a mass of workers who were denied any protections. They were at the lower margin, they were paid very low, and they were kind of no collective bargaining rights. So, but then there are a lot of critiques that emerged, so which started kind of looking into the idea that it is problematic to understand informal sector only with reference to the urban. And why could why do we use that formal and informal dichotomy to understand informal sector? And this is basically the argument given by Jan Bremen, which we will try to understand, that this understanding of the larger picture that we think about informal sector is of workers who are disparate, irregular, at the margin, at the lower level of the economy, having a precarious conditions. So, and most of the time these workers are kind of visualized to be found in the urban areas, in the cities, in the towns. So, this is problematic, and this is what Jan Bremen tries to kind of make us rethink the concept of informal. And the first question that he raises is that why should the formal informal distinction be restricted only to the urban labor? That is, you know, we cannot do this. First we do a mapping between agriculture and industry, and then we say agriculture is formal and industry or urban is informal. This is kind of something that will help deny the understanding of certain features which could be found in agrarian and termed as informal, and obviously formal is kind of found in the urban areas. So, it's not very concrete in terms of applying informal to urban labor and formal to rural labor. So, we realize that this difference, and that's what would be argued through the lecture, that the difference between informal and formal is not technological. It's not that because these workers are unskilled or because they cannot use certain technology that they are in the cities and without any kind of formal employment. It's an historical construction. It emerged because of the changes, the dynamics that were changes in the economy, in the polity, even the role of the state has changed, the economy has changed. It's a kind of moving towards a market dominated economy, and that's how this informal sector kind of needs to be looked into it. So, when we look into this formal informal dualism, Jan Bremen gives us three critiques. The first is that informal sectors are also called unorganized, and that is why are they called unorganized? Because of the understanding that it's a kind of casual force, and they kind of flexible, they are changing, fragmented, so they cannot be organized. It's not, they do not have collective bargaining right. The second critique is lack of clarity regarding the size and dynamics of informal sector. So, because it's kind of a very vast range of workers that come into it, it's also household workers, it's also women, it's children, it's family labor. It's very difficult to segregate who are formal labor. The other problem could also be that there are certain individuals who would be working in the formal sector at the same time also be involved in the informal sector of the household. So, the data in terms of size and of composition of the informal sector is not readily available. the assumption, and this is a kind of something which is very significant. Most of the people understand that the informal sector means self-employment. So, self-employment is the primary employment modality. And therefore, and if we look into it, it's not that all informal sector workers are self-employed. There are many who are working under for the employers who are, and it kind of these dichotomies or dualism is not kind of relevant. So, when we look into the size and dynamic, as we already said, that the estimate of the size of the informal sector is varied. There is no precise size, and it could kind of range from 30 to 70% of urban. And these are studies which are only looking into urban areas for understanding informal sector. Another conceptual problem is that when we look into this informal workers, it could include women, children, differently abled, working from home, and so on. Nature of work arrangement in the informal sector employment to non-employment rather than a sharp break, irregularity and vulnerability. So, it's not a fixed employment, and that also kind of creates a problem in terms of understanding the size. An individual could be employed for say 3 months, and then maybe for 15 days he is unemployed. Again, then he can gets another employment. So that is kind of this shift and breaks would be difficult to arrive at a estimate of the size of informal sector. And many a time in the initial understanding of informal sector, it was seen as a waiting room for peasants and landless laborers, So, in search of work, income, so the idea was that when these people are migrating from say agrarian sector to industry, and they do not have the required skill to work, because when we look into urban areas, it's all part of information society, technology, skilled employment. So they lack these characteristics. So why in a waiting room? Because they will kind of wait for that time to come when they would have acquired the required skill and the industry would absorb them. That is why it is kind of considered as a waiting room. And what does it lead then? Then those who are, say, the recent migrant, there is a kind of a relation established between migrant and the skill level. So, if you are a recent migrant, then you would be unskilled. If you've been there for the city for some number of years, you've learned some skills, then you kind of become semi-skilled and so on, and therefore there is a hierarchy of employment which is created. The second assumption is that it is an urban phenomena, and as I already started with the question, that why should informal workers be found only in urban areas. So, this debate on the informal sector is kind of considered that it is the urban areas which kind of is the house or the residence of informal workers. So, peasants migrate to city in the informal sector before making the jump to the formal sector. So, this you have migrant who, and then you have the or you have the rural area, place and the industry. So, the informal is in between. You come to the city, you are informal, and then you will learn trade and you will learn skill, and then you will be observed as formal employment. This is the kind of commonsensical understanding, but it does not happen that way, because not all would be able to learn the required skill, and not all will be able to be part of the formal. So, it does not go into a transition from informal to formal. It kind of, there are a lot of things that happen between the two, and that is what has to be looked into it. According to Visaria and Jacob, division is caused by the dominant position of the gradient working population. Agricultural employment declined from 74 to 64%, and non-agricultural labor rose from 26 to 35%. So, this kind of is another issue that needs to be looked into it. While we are looking into formalization leading to the growth of informal labor, we also need to look into what was happening to the agrarian or the rural economy in order to understand why there was an increase in informal workers in the cities. So the informal sector employment, and this is the third way in which it has been understood, is in terms of self-employment, that they are kind of people who are engaged and they depend on their livelihood by selling the labor power. And main feature of labor informality is summed up: casual rather than regular job, a constant rotation of the workforce based on the principle of hire and fire. So because they are not kind of entering into it through any written contract or agreement, it could be kind of any time that the company or the factory doesn't require the labor power, they can be thrown out. And when there is a high demand, when there is more and more labor required, especially cheap labor required, they start hiring a number, and that is why we'll see that it becomes a solution for the neo-capitalists to in kind of sustain or kind of support informal worker, because it enables them to save on the all social security benefit. So they kind of say when there is a lean period, there is no production, then they need not pay the worker, they just fire them, and then when there is a production period, they hire casual informal workers so that they can pay them low and again make a greater profit. So self-employment is always looked into as one of the most identifiable feature of informal sector, and the assumption is that most of the informal workers are self-employed, but this is not correct. Jan Bremen would kind of consider it not possible to consider all informal labor in terms of self-employment. So Hart, who had kind of used the term informal labor for the first time in the study of African workers, he kind of makes a distinction between formal and informal in terms of the two criteria, that formal are getting wage earning, the informal are self-employed. But this is kind of problematic, and if we look around today, there are many informal, if we talk about in terms of casual, not being protected by regulation, no organized strength, then there are many informal workers who are getting wage, and again there are formal workers who are kind of getting could be in terms of not getting regular modes of payment. So the critical school of thought, informal sector as petty commodity production and dependent too much on self-employment. Self-employment in informal sector is temporary and unfixed wage. Nevertheless, not all jobs in informal sector is temporary, and similarly, it is kind of very difficult to differentiate the status of worker in relation to the sector they engage or in the sector that they are working. So what is the nature of employment in the informal sector? That is that they kind of, it's blurred. There is no kind of a very clear picture. There could be many informal workers who are enjoying the status or income similar to the formal workers, where there could be many formal sector where the conditions are bad and their workers could be having the same conditions as the informal. So it is kind of a very ambiguous kind of an understanding. The workers in the informal sector have no say in the wage or working hours. This is categorically clear. Because why? Because the wage earning of informal employers are decided at the time of signing the contract or joining, whereas here it's verbal. So it could change, and it could also not necessarily be same for all. So recruitment and promotion in informal sector is by coincidence and arbitrariness. There is no kind of a formal interview or written exam, it's all through spread of words and primordial ties. When supply exceeds demand, and formal sector becomes like that of informal sector. So even in the formal sector, we've seen that if we talk about, say, feature that is working hours, in many formal sector, the people are working more than 14 hours or 15 hours, and not every kind of category of workers are entitled for overtime. It's only one particular category that, of labor workers who would be entitled for overtime. So the hours of work is exceeding, and then the amount of work that is being doing is not necessarily compensated with the wage earning. So the features that have been identified in the informal because of looking at the formal could also be found in the formal sector as well. So, the fourth way in which the formal informal dichotomy has been critiqued by Jan Bremen is that the informal sector is kind of not necessarily a waiting room. It would not necessarily lead you to a destination. This is kind of a lot of studies by research organizations and ILO which says that there will be a clear-cut transition from agrarian workers coming into the urban cities, acquiring the skills and then moving into the formal. But it does not happen in that way, and when they kind of do away with these categories or we do away with the dichotomies, then we will try to understand that it's a fragmented economy rather than a kind of a dual economy. And when we look into the understanding of informal workers as a waiting room, we also need to look into the way that many of them kind of become members of trade union and they start kind of engaging in collective action and increase their bargaining strength. So, there is some amount of upward mobility in urban industrial zone which would lead to the inclusion of newcomers in the formal sector. But as I already said, that it's not kind of the same path, that all those who come to the urban area in search of job would be absorbed by the city. So, when we look into the formalization which led to the emergence of informal labor, what has become today very kind of a significant concept, especially to understand the globalized neoliberalized economy, is the process of informalization. And we see that it is kind of a process which is kind of questions the fact that the waiting room continues to remain a waiting room. Those who comes from the agrarian sector need not necessarily transit to become a formal. So, this waiting room, the numbers is increasing. The numbers of people who are migrating and coming in search of work are increasing, and that has led to the process of informalization. So, rather than an formalized labor relation, the employment dynamics have gone in opposite direction. Large scale people are kind of losing their regular jobs, and if we look into it, the formal workforce has become almost a kind of a very small percentage of the total employment. Informal work, informalization has been increasing, and all the conditions, that is long hours of work, low wage, the withdrawal of collective bargaining, and we see the trade union, which was kind of a very distinctive way to understand formal, has kind of been not functioning that way. So, even the formal sectors are without collective bargaining, without any kind of trade union. So, the move is towards the process of informalization. So, what we try to then understand is that if we were to understand the economy, we cannot understand as dualistic. We cannot apply that economic dualism in terms of agrarian, industrial, rural, urban. What we need to do is we need to understand it as fragmented. So there are different fragments. So there could be a fragment of formal, there could be informal, and then we kind of have a overall idea of the economy, because the moment we do this classification and our focus is on one, we tend to neglect the other. So we will never be able to understand the full nature of economy if we are kind of doing this dualistic understanding. So informal sector consists of diverse workers from different places. They do have things in common, so when we kind of reject the dualism, we see that there is lot of commonalities. And what are these commonalities? Commonalities in the sense, these are features to be found in the formal as well as in the informal sector. So they had little or no training, and a majority of them are illiterate. So this is a kind of a fragment of the workers who are ill trained, who are with less level of education, and they are kind of on the margin. They have no source of income besides their job. So they have kind of, they are not people who have lands maybe in the villages, and these were also theories that would say that number of workers come from rural area in the lean period. When there is no agricultural activity, they come to the city and start working. But this is not sure for all there are large number of individuals who come to the city without any kind of land holding back in the agrarian area. So the job is the only source of livelihood. The wages that they receive are extremely low. The migrant workers sacrifice because they have to sustain, and the sacrifice in the sense that they do not kind of want to be part of any kind of collective union, they don't want to participate in organized labor, and they agree to work at a low wage. High number of workers are women, and that is another statistics that the percentage of women informal workers is increasing. And they have low status. Workers are considered as having socially inferior origin. So there is a lot of kind of harassment. Workers face sexual or domestic kind of violence at the workplace. So Jan Bremen said, rather than forming the economic dualism, we need to have a classification of informal sector workers. All informal sector workers cannot be put into the same category, and he gives us these classification. The first is petty bourgeois. These are money lenders, labor contractor, intermediaries, rent collectors. So we see in terms of their conditions, livelihood or earning is much higher. Then the second category is subproletariat. This is they kind of are between the petty bourgeois, and then we will have the third category, which is the lumpen. These are in between. So they are casual, unskilled workers such as the day laborer, home workers, vendors, soup polishers, messengers. And the third category is the paupers. These are lumpens. These are kind of people who don't have any kind of a job. They are without job, and they kind of indulging maybe in many criminal activities and so on and so forth. But these are not, again, to keep in mind that strict. In one household, you might find individual into all three categories of workers being found, and they could be changed, because the nature of employment changes, the classification can also change, and there is a possibility of upward mobility within the working urban areas. So the classification does not fix the workers into specific category, and there could be overlaps, and there could be a possibility of shifting from one category to the other. While a formal sector may consist of different organization and union, the informal sector, there is a complete lack of it. But there is only kind of again this whole idea that collective bargaining or trade union is absent in the informal sector can be questioned, that we have organization, a trade union of the informal sector, and that is the SEWA. The best example of union within the informal workers is SEWA, or the Self-Employed Women Association. And this union comes up, it's kind of a very organized body, and it kind of comes up against issue raised by employers and their agent. Resistance and dissatisfaction are also expressed through them. These unions usually do not get enough support, but they continue to make an effort to combat the insecurity and miserable conditions. So we have a union in the informal sector, and ILO, which is the International Labour Organization, is kind of working towards and kind of being very hopeful to organize the informal sector and to ensure that they start having a collective bargaining right, so that they are able to negotiate the conditions and improve the conditions under which they are working and living. It was seen that there is a reversal in the nature of working of these employment, and there is continuous formalization of labor, and the formal sector deteriorates. So if when we look into, say, formal and informal, and we say there is a movement towards informalization, then there is a kind of a reverse. Within the informal sector, there are a lot of organizations which are working according to the rules and regulations set up. So informal sector is moving towards formalization, whereas the formal sector is moving towards informalization. And one of the most evident understanding of informalization in the formal sector is the absence, the kind of not many trade union are functioning very effectively. In number of sectors, they are kind of completely absent. So this, therefore, it is kind of not very clear or not very great to understand the economy by fragmenting or by putting into the dualism, but try to understand it as a fragmented economy. So what we do is then, therefore, how do we look into it? So what is it is that is we have to look at it from a redefined agenda or a new agenda, and in that we try to understand that the informal sector was considered as a consequence of limited capacity of the modern economy to observe labor. So when industrialization was happening at a very large scale and migration started happening, not all of them were observed. So it was kind of portrayed as a problem of industrialization, informal sector, because of the incapacity of the modern economy to give employment to all of them. And then by say 80s, 90s, this whole understanding of the dualism was in place, that formal is organized, informal is unorganized. Later on, they kind of, a lot of critique starts emerging, and it leads to a redefinition of the understanding that informal sector was not the problem. It was not the kind of a problem because of the incapacity of industry to observe them, but it was a solution. And what was the solution? The solution was that it was kind of enabling a high rate of growth than it had been realized, because these were the workers who were always into the aspiration to move upward. So they would kind of do a more labor to ensure that they kind of are able to get promoted, or they get observed in the formal sector. So the efficiency of the production increased, which became kind of something which was appropriated by the capitalist, and they kind of start looking at it as an opportunity, that therefore the informal workers would kind of continue to add to the profit of it. So we see this shift in the paradigm from problem to the solution in terms of emergence of the market as dominant institution, and we see the shift from public to private. So we know that the market today is the most dominating institution. It is kind of something that enters into every part, everything. There is a kind of materialist relation, and then kind of from lot of shift from public to private, in the sense that the public sector is kind of going down and the private sector is coming in. So there is privatization of health, education. So the big players, the dominant player, that is the market, is through the private sector. So it has led to the end of the government as protector of common interest. The government is not taking into so much of consideration of the welfare. It is more into towards a kind of looking into larger private market oriented benefit. So when the state has withdrawn, therefore there is a kind of a decline in collective bargaining, in trade union activity, and what can be then said that the informalization of labor is an economic strategy directed by transnational agency like IMF, World Bank for managing globalized world. And what they do is that the kind of Western economy adopted this model. Self-employment, wage flexibilization, lengthening of working hours, withdrawal of protection against dismissal, reducing social care and social care benefit, and therefore informalization becomes a strategy for neoliberal capitalism to sustain itself. So this is the understanding of informal economy, and the references are Jan Bremen, book published in 1996, which is ethnographic study titled Footloose Labor Working in India's Informal Economy, and there is another article which is published in Economic Political Weekly, which is A Dualistic Labor System, a critique of the informal sector concepts. So both the articles by Jan Bremen will help us to have a more holistic understanding of the economy as a fragmented economy. With this, I come to an end of today's lecture. Thank you.